Anti-Racist Film Club podcast, a production of The Commons, the online faith space created by the South Sound Methodist Co-op. But for the purposes of this podcast, we're a bunch of people excited to watch movies and grow together through the lens of anti-racism. I'm your host, Lauren Fontanilla, and today I'm joined by Pastor Alexa Eisenbarth from First Olympia. How are you today, Pastor Alexa?
I am doing well. I'm glad to be here. And I enjoyed the film. So I'm glad and excited to talk about it, Lauren.
It's a very new film. I think we've done a few older ones this season of the podcast and the club, but this one is pretty much brand new. It came out 2022, so
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's sort of part of why we selected it because it's something that is sort of in the national public conversation right now.
hmm
The last film that we talked about, Lauren, you and I, was The Last Holiday, and there was a lot of like interpretive work we had to do. Right, we
hmm
were sort of watching it and drawing out, trying to sort of find and look for the work of anti-racism we could do upon reflection of the movie. This one is much more explicit, right? It is very much like explicitly about racism.
Yes.
So yeah, and it's just in the national, the public conversation right now as a new film.
Yes. There's also some legislation that is extremely relevant. The Federal Anti-Lynching Act, named after Emmett Till, was also passed in 2022.
Yes, yes. And I think they named that at the end of the film.
Yes.
And so it took, now I can't remember the exact years, but, 78 years or something like that in order for it to pass.
hmm
Wild, wild.
So, for those who haven't read the title of today's episode yet, we are discussing the film Till, which I think that I will just jump into a description of and we can start talking about the plot.
Great.
Till is a true story based on the murder of Emmett Bo Till. Written partially by Keith Beauchamp and directed by Chinoya Chukwu, Till is told through the eyes of his mother, Mamie Till-Mobley, and her civil rights activism that followed in the decades after her son's brutal death. When Bo takes a vacation from his home in Chicago to see his cousins down in Money, Mississippi, he is kidnapped, tortured, and killed. The rest of the film centers on the incredible efforts his mother made to shed light on the brutality of his death. And in the final act, Mamie's path towards justice leads down south, where she testifies against his murderers in an infamous 1955 trial. This is a difficult film to watch. Difficult and necessary.
Mm-hmm.
Like Mamie's original decision to hold an open casket funeral, even in 2023, we must acknowledge the harsh truths of our past and present. The story of Emmett Till and his mother is more relevant now than ever.
Thanks, Lauren. Part of the reason this story, I think, sticks in our collective memory so strongly is because of the work of Mamie, Emmett's mom, and in making the choice to have there be an open casket at Emmett's funeral. It really made me think about the now long line of women who followed Mamie and the moms of Black sons who've been lynched, who've been killed, and who have decided to not let it go silently into the night, right? To not let it be forgotten. And so, I'm thinking of people like George Floyd, but also like Michael Brown and Ferguson, right? Like just the stories that have really ignited movements for change and enraged people because they finally saw something that is happening more often than we'd like to think. And so being able to sort of reveal the violence that is occurring and just making sure that it isn't covered up, I think that is one of the legacies of Mamie that we witness in this film, but is also something that's very difficult to witness. We have like this great separation from it now, right? And it's not, we aren't in the room or whatever, but it's also hard to watch people see it, right? I think that was one of the hardest parts of this film for me was like I think it's her cousin, her relative who was in Mississippi comes to the funeral and says, I can't see it. And she's like, we have to see it. And so anyway, that was sort of the crux for me, right? Is just that Mamie really invites people and sort of demands that we look at it. And I think that's representative of sort of the larger movement. And there's lots of people who have followed in her footsteps in that way.
Yes, definitely. There is a creative choice that the director made that fits in with this conversation. And the
Mhm.
choice was to not show violence on screen towards Black bodies.
Yeah.
We see the effects
Mhm.
because we're rooted in Mamie's perspective. And so we see what the violence has done to her son, Emmett, but we don't see it actually happening.
Yeah.
Did you notice that? Or is that like, are you just hearing about this?
Yeah, no, I noticed it. I don't think I knew that it was an explicit choice, but I was appreciative of it. I have to be honest, I put off watching this film for as long as possible, and I think that was part of it. Was like I was anticipating having to witness violence, which is not particularly enjoyable or good for my well-being.
Hmm.
And I think that that is instructive for us as a society now, right? So Mimi makes sure that everyone sees, the effects, right? To see what the outcome of the violence was. But now, in so much of our reckoning with police brutality in particular,
Hmm.
body cam video being published, being made public, and for people to like consume this violence has been a problem. I mean, and I think it's part of our, our national conversation of like, are we being desensitized to this violence that it's not even shocking anymore because we see it so often.
Right.
And there's something about, right, being honest and truthful and having this account that's from a camera, right? That there's like and something observing what happened rather than just the witnesses' testimonies of people who lived or like survived and were well enough to tell the tale, potentially untruthfully. So like body cameras are good, but is it good for the public to consume so much violence, especially against people of color and people who are marginalized in our society? And I don't think so. Like I don't think it's good for us on the whole.
There's definitely the argument that it's dehumanizing in many ways. I know that at one point a few years ago now, I was watching some commentary about the film 13th,
Hmm.
the documentary about the prison system and institutionalized racism.
Hmm.
And I know that director, Ava DuVernay, was on record as saying that she didn't want to make films that involved violence with Black bodies because of her worry that audiences would be desensitized
Hmm.
and would start to see people as just their bodies and not whole persons.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think that this movie does that as well, right? Like Emmett, we never, because we don't see him actively being injured, we know that it's happening, but he gets to be a whole person, right? And his family and in their complexity. I think that was a really interesting piece too of how Mamie was portrayed in the media and that she had to kind of protect her image and that Emmett's dad had died and that, then his mom had been remarried and then divorced and was, seeing someone new. And there were so many people who grieved him.
Hmm.
That was another like significant point, right? That isn't always told in the story. When we tell the plot points, you don't always hear the wider story. To think of his grandparents mourning him and his like soon to be stepdad mourning him, those stories don't always get to be told, especially when there's like a fight to be had for justice.
Hmm.
And that's an important fight and it's a good fight and it's not the whole story.
I think one of the most interesting parts of the film to me was the publicity that
Mhm.
went into Mamie's trip down south
Mm, mhm.
and how her fiance wasn't invited
Yeah.
because they weren't married and he wasn't Emmett's father. And so it would have been easy to spin a story that took the complexity and then demonized it.
Yeah, and they use religious language for it, which was really interesting. So she's like, they're going to, cast me as a Jezebel. They're saying I'm a Jezebel,
Hmm.
which is a term, a name for sort of it's a caricature of a woman who is a temptress, right? And a foreign woman, especially like that. Like white women are not called Jezebels. It's Jezebels are people who are foreign temptresses. To cast her as a Jezebel is very much this othering, right? Not only in her womanhood, but also in her race and her the sort of like othering, like you're foreign, you're not one of us. That double oppression in that accusation.
Hmm.
So, one of the pieces that I thought was really profound and helpful framing that I had not heard before was right after Emmett Till was murdered. There was someone who came on TV who worked for the NAACP, and he said something like this: when the message to white folks is to stop Negroes from advancing by any means short of violence, it's not too long before someone doesn't stop short.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was a really helpful framing, and especially in regards to the ongoing conversation about police brutality. I think we can all agree that police are given sort of the most permission to enact force.
Yes.
Enact like brute force in our society, right? That they have this this authority to do that, and so they have authority to exert more force upon others than any other sort of citizen. So if the charge for police in particular, who, you know, we are sort of coming to understand, especially as white people, which I am, that police sort of have this history of like that they, in a lot of ways, policing in America upholds white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
And so if police in some ways are enforcers of white supremacy and their charge is to use force up to a certain extent, right, in order to uphold it, then it's not surprising that with an inch they take it a mile. It's not a hard leap to make. It's a small step into killing people,
Mm-hmm.
even though that isn't their explicit charge.
Yeah. I mean, there's also the side of accountability too,
Mm-hmm.
that if people aren't being held accountable, then they're much more likely to then escalate beyond what they might morally have the ability to do.
Absolutely. I think accountability is a really interesting question in this story as well, because in the perspective of the Bryants, I think is their names, in the perspective of the Bryants, so the woman who Emmett supposedly, you know, hit on or was flirting with, and her husband, in their perspective, I think that they thought that they were holding Emmett as a representative of all Black people accountable to the social contract, which is white supremacy.
Mm.
In their mind, Emmett betrayed the social construct. Like he went beyond the bounds that have been placed around Black people, like of what was appropriate and acceptable. Even though those bounds, right, we can clearly see are unjust and racist and violent and evil.
Mm-hmm.
In their minds, it's the water they're swimming in, right? And so Emmett in some way betrayed this in their perspective, and so their response is an attempt at like holding accountable the entire Black race for their transgressions, right? Their crossing over of the boundaries, the way that they aren't able to uphold society and be quote unquote civilized.
Yeah. Also, accountability, I think, comes in on Mamie's side, still to do with the Bryants, where she really wants to hold Caroline. Is it Caroline?
Carolyn.
Yeah, the woman in the relationship.
Yeah.
She wants to hold her accountable because it's her words and her accusation that got Emmett killed. And even though her husband and brother in law are on trial, she's not at all. And of course, no one ends up getting held accountable legally in the end anyway because of how the ruling turns out. But the fact that Carolyn or Caroline was never even deposed,
Right.
that's a huge injustice in Mamie's perspective.
And she gives false witness.
Yes, yeah.
So I mean, we'll talk about that in a minute. But there's a moment towards the beginning of the film after Emmett is killed where Mamie says like she's going to be fine. She has her kids and she's going to be fine. And like she had this knowledge, like this knowing that there was never going to be any consequences for her,
Mm-hmm.
which is a, you know, stark indictment on our justice system and our society and culture as well. I think that this story like is a really difficult one to reckon with for white women, right? I think it's a really harsh indictment on white women.
Mm-hmm.
I think appropriately, right? And it's challenging. And here's what I think people do. People want to believe or say to themselves, right, like that I am not a racist because I'm not lynching Black kids.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not committing violence towards people, physical violence. So I'm not a racist. And this story asks the question and takes it a step further and says, like, right, what danger are you creating for people by your either action or inaction or false accusations?
Or complacency.
Yeah, or complacency, right? Like what is the situation that you might be helping to create that makes violence more likely or more possible? And that piece is hard. It's hard to reckon with, coming to terms with that you are participating in racism occurring and violence occurring without ever having to do it yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And this story just really forces you to ask that question of yourself, which I think is a good one to ask, and it's a difficult one to reckon with.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering too, right, like that I think in a lot of situations in our world, we're not necessarily putting people in physical harm's way, but there are other ways that we put people in other kinds of danger.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm thinking in particular, Lauren, I wonder what this brings up for you, but I'm thinking about like in the workplace, like the ways that in the workplace white supremacy is enforced and has been enforced. In order to enforce them, you inherently put people at risk of losing their job.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So let's, for example, like if there's a particular expectation that people don't have dreadlocks, right? Like that's been a policy in corporate America, right? That you don't have dreadlocks at work. So then you have Black people who have dreadlocks. And so they either have to change their hair and spend money and time changing their hair in some way, making their hair more difficult to manage or whatever it is, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you enforce this policy, which is a policy of white supremacy, then that person is at risk of not having any more income. And so they're at risk of all sorts of other things. And like economic violence, I don't think most of us would claim it as that or would name it as violence, but to create barriers for people between their survival and their thriving for white supremacy, right? That's violence.
Mm-hmm.
And to uphold that.
In a very similar vein, it makes me think of dress codes in workplaces and
Mhm.
how the same outfit on two different people can bring up extremely different responses. And a lot of it just has to do with the body type that that person has.
Mhm.
And there is definitely a racial bias against people who have characteristics like more curvature that technically have it's not rooted in science, but
Right, right.
it's an association with race that is either a conscious or unconscious bias in people who set dress codes.
Yeah, I'm thinking of even this year there, I think in Missouri, in like the state legislature, there was a woman in the Republican Party, a white woman, who proposed this legislation, this policy for the members of the state legislature that was a dress code. And it was very much particularly aimed at the Black women who were representatives in the state legislature.
Mm.
And I don't remember all of the particulars, but at one point, the white woman who's a Republican sort of stood up and said, I know, don't you think we could have expected these adult women to dress appropriately? And they are dressed appropriately, right? There's
Mm-hmm.
not any inappropriateness to the way that they're dressed, but there is a perception that what they are wearing is inappropriate. And I think because they have this lens of, indoctrination, if you will, right? That Black women are Jezebels, right? That they're temptresses. And so anything that they do or say is over sexualized and made into this potential threat,
Mm-hmm.
this threat to others. And so I think that's what they see in the film, right? They see that in Mamie by calling her Jezebel.
Well, there's also like the over sexualizing of things, but then it's not out of care for someone's being like, oh, you will be over sexualized, and that might invite violence towards you. That's not really the message because it's blaming the person for wearing their hair a certain way or wearing clothes on their body a certain way. And it's not done out of care, it's just done out of fear.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no attempt in these like proposed legislation, right? These proposed policies to protect Black women, right? Like that is just absolutely not the intent. It's to continue to enforce the norms of white culture in what is deemed to be white spaces. And government is one of those places, right? That has been sort of deemed unofficially white space with white culture, and it's been made and developed in white culture. And so when there's any deviation from that, it is seen as a threat, and a threat to the way that things are, which is scary, right? People are afraid of that in a lot of ways, which change is difficult, but it's not something, right? To have your fear become something that becomes policy for other people doesn't seem like an effective use of fear, and it doesn't seem like an appropriate way to manage fear. At least in my perspective. I think there's a lot of things that fear tells us, but it might not always be what we think it is on the surface, right? I don't think that woman who's the white Republican who proposed this policy, I don't think she thinks she's being racist, right? And I don't think she thinks she's afraid, right? Like, I don't think she has these conscious knowings, right? She hasn't uncovered what might be underneath that. She learned a rule, and other people seem to not be following it. And so that seems unfair. And so there's, right. And it's like, I get that. I do that in other ways. I can definitely get there. And that's not ultimately what it is about and how it plays out in a community. How it plays out is violence. And so I think that's a key thing in anti-racism, right? That like, we are racist because we swim in racist culture. To admit that, or to acknowledge that we might not be aware of all of the ways that we are upholding and enforcing white supremacy, it doesn't have to be something that is so self-deprecating. We don't have to just crumble underneath the weight of that. Like, I think acknowledging that gives us some freedom and some power to then do something about it, then start catching ourselves when we're doing it, and question, like, what are my motivations here, right? Like, why am I so worked up about this thing, right? Why am I activated about this experience I'm having? And then we can start asking ourselves those questions, and maybe it has nothing to do with race, and but to wrestle with it is the work of anti-racism.
Yes.
And to build community around that, so that you have people who are, in the same boat as you a lot of times, or in different boats as you, to help you kind of process those things and figure out what your motivations might be, and to change course.
So, what other aspects of the film stood out to you? Are there any particular scenes?
Absolutely. Yes. There's a few things. So one piece is that there were Black men who participated in the lynching of Emmett Till. I'm watching right now the show The Last of Us. I don't know if you've seen it, Lauren, but
I don't have HBO Max, otherwise I would have.
Okay, anyway, so this show, right, is about, it's an apocalyptic show where this fungus takes over, and it becomes like an illness in people, and they become zombie-like, but they are not zombies. Anyway, so it's like the end of the world as we know it. And so when this happens, the federal government becomes authoritarian, right? Probably enact martial law, become this like fascist government ultimately, in order to contain and stop this fungus from spreading. And in the midst of this, they are, when people get bitten by the other people, they like won't tell people they got bitten, right? As most zombie shows. And so there are people who don't tell. And there are people who are fighting against this fascist government. So the sort of the enemies of the fascist government are the people who might be infected, and the people who are resisting their fascism. And so in the community, there become people that they call collaborators. And those collaborators are people who sell out their community members, their friends and family, in order to survive themselves, right? And they are like ostracized to no end. And there are people like coming after them and wanting to kill these collaborators. And it made me think of that. There are collaborators in the Emmett Till story. There are Black men who participate in the lynching, and they don't necessarily reckon with that a whole lot in the film. And it's a thing I think we should talk about just like generally as a society. But it makes me think of, I'm forgetting their names. But there was a man who was killed recently by police. There were 5 policemen, and all of them were Black. And the man who was killed was Black as well. there's this story that emerged, right? That like policing isn't racist if Black police are killing Black people. Like then it's not racism. Racism isn't the problem.
Yeah.
And sort of this dismissal of policing being a racist construct and having racist origins. I wonder that, like, I had never heard that. I had never heard that there were Black men that were participants in the lynching of Emmett Till. I hadn't known that. And I wonder if part of the reason I hadn't heard that before is because we don't really know what to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not like a feature of the story.
It's another complexity because
Yeah.
it's an extremely complex story, but when it's reduced in history books to a couple paragraphs, you can't fit in all of the humanizing elements or the parts that are difficult to understand or reckon with.
Right, right. And I think we do see it in another way. There's a farmhand who they like chased down because he was a witness, basically. And I don't think he saw anything, but heard the entire lynching take place.
Mm-hmm.
And on the stand, they ask him, like, why didn't you call for help? Like, why didn't you do anything? And all he could say was, I couldn't.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for people who are not living under the constant threat of violence, I think that that is really hard to even conceptualize. I, for my whole life, have known and trusted that, like, I generally trust other adults in particular, right? Like, even as a kid, it's like, I was instructed to ask for help and I knew that I would without any danger,
Mm-hmm.
like that there were these systems that were there to protect me and that there were adults that I could ask for help. And to not feel that, right? To feel that actually, like, if you dare whistle in the wrong direction, you'll be lynched. If you step out of line at all, even unknowingly, you could be met with major violence and ultimately your death. I just don't think that people who haven't experienced that, I think it's really hard to imagine being in a place where there's no one to help and there's nothing that you can do to solve the problem.
We definitely get that perspective through the different points. They call him Preacher,
Mm-hmm.
but I think that's a nickname. I think his name is Moses or Mose.
Yeah, I think you're right.
It's Mamie's uncle, cousin, family
Mm-hmm.
member who was looking
Mm-hmm.
after Emmett.
Yeah.
And Emmett was kidnapped from his house.
Yeah.
And there's 2 points that fall into this line of thinking. And one is that he was the first Black man to testify against a white defendant in a court system in that particular county. I don't know. His plan was to immediately move after the trial. I don't know if that happened, but in the movie, I think it's implied that it did.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second is that when Mamie visits his house during the trial, she sees that he had a gun. One of the things that he had been telling her is that he couldn't do anything because the people who kidnapped his son, or sorry, her son, were holding his family at gunpoint.
Mm-hmm.
And so she asks, "Why didn't you grab yours?" And he has a very similar response of like, "I couldn't. Like that wasn't an option."
Right, right. And it's hard to conceptualize, right? Like we get all of these individual instances of things. And so, like, especially in our public conversation around police brutality, right? There are instances and particular, incidents that occur. And we focus in on the particularities of the instance. And it's a lot harder to string them all together and to zoom out and look at the whole thing as the water we're swimming in.
Mm-hmm.
To think about it in a way that, like, no, this actually permeates everything. And it's like the fact that these incidents are occurring are a public demonstration of what will happen to you if you step out of line. And that line is whatever we decide, we meaning the police, or me meaning white people. And to have that constant fear, like your options are limited, are much more limited than I think other white people in particular can imagine. And even Mamie, right, who lived in Chicago, like had a really hard time imagining that they live under constant threat of violence. Like that is not her lived experience. She lives in Chicago. She experiences racism, but definitely in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
And so to live in a place where there is active, constant, real threat of violence to your body at all times, and the constant threat for every single one of your loved ones and all of your neighbors, it's an impossible scenario. It's
Mm-hmm.
an impossible scenario, and you have so many fewer options.
I think one point in the film that really illustrates Mamie's reality in Chicago and how different it is from in Mississippi is when she is shopping in a retailer and the manager, the person who's in charge of the floor, makes a very obvious microaggression. It's like, hey, we have shoes in the basement too. And she responds, do you tell all the customers that?
Mm-hmm.
She has the ability to question him and to stand up for herself, even if she doesn't immediately call him out for racism. She definitely implies it. That would not have been an option for any of her family members.
Yeah, absolutely. She's able to be a bold, strong woman of resistance, right? Because it's a bit safer for her to do so. I think it is a huge act of bravery for her to take that with her to Mississippi. And she opts to do that, right? She opts into taking that boldness to the place where she's at way bigger risk, right? So she does ultimately make that choice. But she also has some different protections around her, right? She has the NAACP around her. And
She's also staying in Mount Bayou,
yes,
which I had never heard of at all.
me either.
That was a completely new part of the narrative that I was not familiar with. And it definitely falls into this theme that we've been talking about from the film of spaces
Mhm.
and expectations and societal contracts. And so I wonder if you have any thoughts on how Mount Bayou played into what its role in the film was.
Okay, so there's this larger narrative around Black people in particular, but around all marginalized people that, like, I'm going to say around about Black people in particular, right? That there's this idea that, like, that Africa, the continent, is and always has been this uncivilized place, and that the trope is that Black people are, all the tropes, but they're incapable of making a quote unquote civilized society, and that they can't participate in it because the civilized society that people have in mind is white society. And even so, we have places like Mount Bayou, right? And it also makes me think of Black Wall Street,
Mm-hmm.
which is like in Tulsa. These communities that were developed and thriving, that were Black communities, like Black built societies and communities that were fully functioning and communal and like protective of one another, and where people were successful and had, I mean, like, I don't know what your perception was of Mount Bayou when they portrayed it, but just like, I'm like, oh, this is like a really nice town. Like, the
Mm-hmm.
streets are clean. There's an active downtown with lots of businesses that are thriving, right? And it's like what we imagine for a functional community. These places where Black people are very much doing the thing that the stories of racism say they cannot do. Of course we don't know about them, Lauren, because these stories reject the story of white supremacy that we hear. It goes against the main story. It goes against what they're trying to get us to think. They, meaning, I don't know, the powers that be, or the water that we're swimming in, right? It goes against the current.
I like the repeated use that we've had of the phrase "the waters that we're swimming in," especially in reference to Mount Bayou,
Mhm.
because the image that stuck out to me most was the community pool full
Mm,
of happy Black children
yeah,
who didn't have to be worried that they were having fun in public.
right, right, right. That just shouldn't be a privilege, right? But it was and is a privilege to be careless and innocent and free as a child in public.
Just as a side note on the phrase of like innocence, that
Mhm.
is the title of Mamie's memoir autobiography, is The Death of Innocence. And I know that the creators of the film read that book over and over again to try and get stuff as accurate to the experience that she wanted people to have from the narrative.
Yeah, absolutely.
So largely it is a story about death of innocence.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think they did a thing in the film of, like, right after he dies, they find him, and, there's this, they end up putting Emmett on trial, basically, right? Like, Emmett is ultimately the one on trial
Mm.
in the public sphere as well as in the courtroom, right? It's like, did he do something wrong enough for this to be justified? Ultimately, is the question.
Hmm.
Miss Bryant's testimony very much even though it was like false and exaggerated, right, makes it so that everyone is like, oh yeah, like he did something bad enough that it was justified. And we can see that in hindsight clearly now, I think, right? Like we can watch this and you're like, wow, that was obviously wrong. But I think we do it all the time now, right? Like in instances of police brutality in particular, we ask the question, like, well, what did this person do that made them get shot by police or whatever, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
well, they didn't put their hands up fast enough, or they had their hand in their pocket, or they had a hoodie on, right?
Yeah. None of which are crimes.
Right, correct, right? It's those are things everyone does. And so for us to make something that is innocent into a reason for execution is just wild. And it's a symptom and like facet of white supremacy that we do that. The other sort of piece I don't want to miss because I am a pastor is is the points of faith in the film
Mm-hmm.
and faithfulness. So when Emmett's body was returned to Chicago and came off the train, that scene was so profound and moving for me, in part because of Mamie's faith and expressions of faith in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
She falls all over the pine box that he's in, and is just sobbing and cries out like, open the box, he can't breathe. She so much sees life in her son, right? Like she saw so much life that she can't even imagine him dead, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like impossible. It's just this thing that's outside of her imagination. And then she cries out to God saying, show me what you want me to do and make me able to do it. And I don't know if it's in that moment or just following that moment, but I thought that was a really beautiful prayer. Show me what you want me to do and make me able to do it.
Which is then immediately followed by the scene where she sees her son's body
Yes.
and all the ways that it was brutalized. There's definitely a transformation in her line of thinking where her anger and her rage grows in the scene,
Mhm.
as well as despair. And I think at the beginning of the scene, she doesn't know what to do, but by the end of it, she is very strongly convinced that like she has a path forward and she knows how to use the legacy to enact justice or make a difference in the future. And so in some ways, it's an answered prayer, but
Mhm.
not a joyful one at all.
Sure, sure. Yeah. And I think too, like when oh gosh, and I can't remember what his role is now, but the man who is her initial contact, and he like he works with the mayor and someone else, a councilman or something.
Mm-hmm.
And he initially is like, take advantage of this, right? Like this is an opportunity, and is sort of like trying to get her to think of the larger implications of her son's death. And at that point she's not ready to go there, and is really like, this is my son and he's dead, like that's what I know, and I'm in the grief and loss of that, which is totally appropriate. And she comes to realize that, or come to this point of like, not that I appreciated that the story was not turned into like that he died for something,
Mm-hmm.
or that like it was ever intended.
Oh, I think that's especially profound in the last scene where
Mm,
the movie I thought was going to end with her making this grand speech and like taking on the role of like the death will mean something, but it doesn't end there. It actually ends in a very still shot of her mourning in his bedroom, and
yeah,
that it wasn't for a reason or like a mysterious path or something like that.
right.
It was just a tragedy.
Yes, it was just a tragedy. And she I, I don't know how I want to put this, but like she didn't let the tragedy lie, or like she didn't let it be for naught, right? Like to she sought justice, and she allowed and ensured that the public saw, that the community, that the society saw who they were by looking at her son, and that there was this at least effort for like revelation and repentance and changing course, and that she didn't shy away from that. And I think that that was really brave. She reminded me in the scene where Emmett is Emmett's body is being returned to Chicago and coming off the train. And when she's looking at his face, when she's looking at him, she reminds me of the women at the cross with Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
So if you don't know that story, all of the disciples leave Jesus and they are not there when he dies, or most of them are not. One man takes down his body and offers his tomb, but it's the women who prepare the body for burial. And so there's lots around that. But I think that there is, and a lot of like feminist readings around that scenario. But I think that there's something about women being able or having some sort of deep strength. And I don't know if it comes from like a particular experience that women have or just the overarching experience that women have, but just the ability to like look horror in the face and to be present to suffering and like not violence, but to be present to suffering, and are ultimately the ones who end up responding to that violence and responding to the suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just saw her really in that way of her tenderly touching his body and just like looking at him in the face and seeing the humanity in Emmett beyond what they did to him. She, as his mother, as someone who loved him, could still see the little boy underneath all of the mutilation. And so I think that's perhaps a call for us as well, like in our anti-racism work, to develop that ability within ourselves to see the children, to see the innocence, to see the humanity in other people, even though they've been victims of violence, rather than trying to justify the violence. The spiritual practice for us then becomes to cultivate the ability to see the human being first before we see like the criminal, right? That's really because Jesus, right? Jesus was executed for supposedly being a criminal, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we would all say that there's this like deep value and it was wrong that he was crucified. The spiritual practice for us always is to see people rather than as criminals or whatever other label that we give people for existing in society, right? In all the ways that we exist in society and make mistakes or missteps.
I feel that's it's a really good place to leave out. I know we could talk
Sure.
about this for like hours and hours, but I value your time.
Thank you, Lauren. I value yours too. And yeah, thank you for just being a great conversation partner about these films. It's been, it's just really fun and engaging and a helpful practice for me as well. It's just valuable to spend this time doing some of this work. And you're a wonderful and faithful conversation partner. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you, listeners, for listening to the Anti-Racist Film Club. That was such a smooth transition. Thank you for listening to the Anti-Racist Film Club podcast. If you haven't seen Till, it's currently available to rent most places you can rent movies. If you've found a free option, let me know. To learn more about the Anti-Racist Film Club itself, visit filmcoli.org or follow the links in our description below. This is a monthly podcast, so be sure to follow us on whatever platform you're currently listening to, such as Spotify, Anchor, or Apple Music, so you don't miss out on our next upload. And feel free to share with us. Oh my gosh. I feel so flustered after compliments. And feel free to share us with your friends, the number one way you can support this podcast. But before we sign off, I just want to thank you, Pastor Alexa, for leading our conversation today.
Thank you, Lauren. I'm glad to.
And a special final announcement that next month, while there will be no official club meeting, the podcast will still release a normally scheduled episode. So be sure to tune in and give us a listen. Otherwise, thanks for listening.